Today we have Dr. Chris Ferguson, who is a professor of clinical and developmental psychology at Stetson University. He's published more than 300 peer-reviewed scientific papers that have been cited nearly 30,000 times, and two nonfiction books, including How Madness Shaped History, an eccentric array of maniacal rulers, raving narcissists, and psychotic visionaries. Chris is widely viewed as one of the world's leading experts on video game violence, social media's effects on young people, and reforming science to improve the replicability of research. So, it is a great pleasure that we have Dr. Ferguson here with us
All
today.
right. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it. And by the way, for people that are watching, I want to explain like this is obviously being filmed in mirror image, right? Because you can actually read the reverse psychology on the T-shirt. In real life, it's reversed, which is the joke, right? So my wife got this for me. She always wants me to point out that she gets credit for buying this joke T-shirt, but it's not a joke if you can actually read it.
So is it printed in reverse?
It's printed in reverse in real life. Yeah.
Okay.
So you're seeing it like legible, like easily readable because this is being recorded in mirror image, basically. You know,
Huh.
what's on the right is actually on the left and all that stuff. So
I like it. I like it a lot.
yeah.
Cool.
In one of our previous episodes, Andrew Shabilsky critiqued the correlational research on the relationship between social media and mental health, and how that we can't really determine if social media use causes the harms we hear about in the media with that type of research. Fortunately, Chris recently published a meta-analysis of all of the experimental studies of the effects of social media on mental health. So, Chris, what did you find in your latest research?
Whether it's self-report or some kind of measuring tool on the device, which is a little bit better than self-report, is that linked with some kind of mental health outcome, which could be depression, anxiety, life satisfaction, just general wellness, or even in some cases, people are talking about trans identification or other gender issues, and so on and so forth. And is there also, on the other hand, is there evidence to this belief that reducing social media time can improve people's wellness? So that's kind of the difference between the correlational longitudinal studies with kids versus the experimental studies, where you take usually a bunch of young adults in most cases, sometimes kids, and you have them stop using social media for a day or a week or several weeks or whatever else. And generally, the evidence suggests from the correlational research, which I actually think is better quality, not great quality, not good quality, but better quality, is that there doesn't seem to be very much link between at least time spent on social media and any kind of mental health outcome. And the experimental data is a little bit trickier because the studies are not very good. And that's, again, I want to make sure I emphasize that point because it seems really hard for people to get that, is that the studies are very, very poor quality. And they don't really get at the kind of questions people are interested in many cases, because the hypothesis of the study is just obvious to the participants, and they tend to change their behavior as a consequence of that. But even taking those studies at face value, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that reducing social media time is helpful, or certainly not to the extent that people have claimed that there's a clear, direct one-to-one relationship. All you need to do is get kids off of this stuff and they'll be fine. The kind of narrative that has evolved in our society simply it just doesn't fit the data from these studies, even if you take them at face value, which you shouldn't because they're very poor in quality. And of course, that upsets certain other groups of people who have, whether it's politicians, some scholars, activists who poured a lot of money and political prestige into scaremongering, basically, and scaring the crap out of a lot of people over these types of issues. So that's where things are at this point. Nobody likes good news when they're in the middle of a moral panic, basically.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by the quality of those studies is poor? What are the biggest problems with those studies? Why should we not believe them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a couple different things. So first off, I think the biggest thing for me is just what we call demand characteristics, which is a technical term that means that, and sometimes you hear it referred to as the Hawthorne effect too. It's like the idea that when people know they're being observed and they know why they're being observed, and then they tend to change their behavior. Probably everybody remembers back when they were a kid and the teacher would come into class and say, today, the principal's coming to visit the class and he's coming to take all the bad children away. And then the principal comes in, and all the little kids are sitting at their desks being little angels and this kind of stuff. And that's not their normal behavior. They're behaving that way because they know they're being observed and they know why, or they think they know why in this case. Usually the teacher's being a little bit deceptive. The principal's observing him or her, not necessarily the kids, but the kids think they're going to get in trouble because the principal's scary, basically. So the same thing happens in experiments. We know this happens. We know that when people can guess the hypothesis of a study, any study, they tend to change their behavior in the direction of what the hypothesis is. Most people will tend to change their behavior in the direction of what they think the hypothesis is. So it's very, very important in most research, well, social science research at least, to make sure that people don't really understand the hypothesis. For instance, in medical research, don't know what group they're in. They're blinded to what condition they are in, so that they don't artificially change their behavior in ways that just damage the validity of the study. And unfortunately, in these studies, people are being told, stop using Facebook. And oh, by the way, how do you feel about yourself? Essentially, again, a day or a week or several weeks later. And it's pretty obvious. I mean, if you paid attention to news media at all in the last 10 years, I mean, anybody's going to be able to guess what answers they're supposed to give after, a day or a week or a month of stopping social media use. So unfortunately, the hypotheses of these studies are absolutely obvious to the participants. And given that that is a fact, it's actually astounding that the results are so poor in these studies. But that is a major issue. The other thing is a lot of these studies will salami slice their data in various ways. I saw one, for instance, and I don't remember the author's name, and it's probably just as well, but I saw one where they had a measure of well-being, and it included individual single questions about depression, anxiety, life satisfaction, self-esteem. All these things kind of correlate very highly with each other. They're really all, there's an argument at least that they're really kind of all the same thing because of the high correlation between them. So with this overall measure, they found no evidence that reducing social media time over several weeks improved. So what they then did is they split it out by question. So they analyzed each question separately. And there it was like 5 or 6 questions, individual questions, by the way, not like individual surveys, but individual questions. So they analyzed every single question differently. And they found a statistically significant effect, barely over 0.05 for depression. And ironically, the effect, so it might have been like a P, again, a little bit inside baseball, I apologize with using stats. But for those people that know stats, like a P of 0.04 or something like that for depression. And then they found that the effect size was the opposite for anxiety. So anxiety actually got worse for the people that had reduced their social media time, but it was like a P of 0.06. So it wasn't quite statistically significant or whatever. So that's what happened. There's just 2 items that kind of moved in the opposite direction a little bit, and everything else was non-significant. But of course, the one that they highlight is the, we found depression, everybody gets better with depression. The effect size was tiny. It was barely statistically significant, and the way they did it was by tearing it out of this larger measure. And that all smacks of like, come on. I mean, you're just like snooping through your data to find the result that you want. That this all should have been pre-registered, and it wasn't. So there really is a lot of this, and it's been observed in past fields related to this, like video game studies and television violence studies and all that kind of stuff, where people just are hunting around in their data, trying to find whatever they can that is statistically significant, ignoring any other data that doesn't fit the narrative, and then they highlight that thing, and then that misleads the public. So the public now thinks that there's a study that suggests that reducing social media time is helpful for mental health, but it's not actually what the data showed in that study. It was really like, again, I try to be careful using the term p-hacking, but it was pretty close to some kind of p-hacking type behavior that I think people are engaging in a lot of these things. So yeah, there's a lot of really sketchy practices in this field, unfortunately.
I've never heard the term salami slicing used in this way before. But I do feel like it's a better, more accessible term than questionable research practices or QRPs or questionable theoretical interpretive practices, Q-tips, which I think Mark Grant came up with.
Yeah. Methodological flexibility.
So the salami slicing is they didn't find what they wanted, so then they went digging around and found a thing with one slice out of the entire salami.
And that's what they sell to the public. Everything else is thrown in the trash, basically, or at least not highlighted. They did report it in their results section to give them credit, but they didn't highlight it in the abstract, and certainly didn't highlight it in the press release and all that kind of stuff. So it becomes misleading to the public, yeah.
And is the bulk of this coming from social psychologists, or who are the people that are primarily this research, and how is it
Everybody's bad. There are no
Yeah,
good
yeah.
guys here. And certainly there are social psychologists that are involved in the stuff. And that, again, tends to be very true for a lot of like the moral panicky kind of things about media and technology. Ironically, in this field, there are a unusually high number of economists who are actually doing some of this research too. And it's not any better. You think economists should be smart, and I'm sure they are. I'm not trying to say, but their research is just as bad with this stuff, and they haven't. And it seems like, again, this is true for psychologists and sociologists too, but it seems like they have no sort of sense of like effect size, and that's a problem too. Studies, some of them are big. They may run like, particularly with the economist ones, they may run 1,000, hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 people through some of these big studies. And they find an effect size that's, basically near zero. But because they ran 1,000 people through it, it becomes statistically significant. And they don't tell people, what they tell you is that there's a difference. They don't tell you that the difference is barely bigger than zero. I think that's been a big problem with a lot of this too. I think if people said something like, hey, look, social media, a marginal, almost zero, but not quite zero effect on people's wellness. Again, maybe I would disagree with that, but I wouldn't think that that was scandalously unethical. But what we're hearing is that like teen suicide wouldn't be as high as it is if only we could get rid of social media. And that is not the kind of implication that any of these studies, whether they're correlational or experimental, can support in any way. But nobody's good. Everybody's involved in this. I don't know why the economists thought this. Shouldn't they be making us more money or something? I mean, I don't know why they thought this was a good idea to get involved in.
Yeah, so I'll admit I've been some of the state attorneys general that are suing some of these companies and working with some of the that are involved in some of these cases. And for the most part, they do seem like they're talking to a diverse group of experts. They can't help but ask me about my PhD advisor, John Haidt. I give them my interpretation of what the data
Yeah.
say, and their response is usually, oh, good. That's pretty much what the epidemiologists we've talked to have said too. So it seems like the actual experts in that field are maybe helping
Yeah.
these lawsuits move in a way that will maybe be good or just, as opposed to just running towards the thing that we're panicking about because there are some people in public that are drumming up these sexy and seductive and kind of terrifying narratives
Right.
of, oh my goodness, this is going to cause the end of society as we know it, as with every new technology that comes out. Somehow, some way, we persist. The printing
Yeah.
lead to the end of us.
Hmm. Yeah, that seems to be, and we know this from history, even recent history, right? There was similar kind of movements with video game violence, and that kind of ended in the 2010s. And now you don't really hear much of it. Occasionally people will say something about video game violence, but the amount of energy behind that topic is dying off significantly. Nobody cares about television violence much anymore. And before that, there was rock music in the 80s. That's why I reference Ozzy Osbourne and Judas Priest. They really were sued by parents who thought that their kids committed suicide because of that music. Dungeons and Dragons, similar stuff going on there. Then you go back into comic books in the 1950s. You had a very Jonathan Haidt-like individual, Frederick Wertham, who had a best-selling book and was testifying in Congress and telling people that comic books were making kids delinquent and gay because Batman and Robin were secretly gay, apparently, or something like that. I'm not making this up, which has interesting with today's concerns about social media making kids trans and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and I think Jonathan was on PBS at one point saying something like that about teen girls possibly becoming trans because of social media or their connections and interactions on social media, something like that. So we're seeing these kind of parallels quite a bit. And yeah, it does seem to be like it's very, very difficult to break out of this cycle because we can look back and we think parents sued Ozzy Osbourne because of the Suicide Solution song, and we kind of giggle and go, "Oh, that's stupid." I mean, who the hell thought that? Now the people that go to a concert for one of these guys, they're all like 95 years old, right? It's hard for us if we hit in like the parenting age or we get into middle age. It just seems like intuitive. Whatever's happening now with technology just can't be good, right? We had this like Goldilocks sort of phenomenon where we think that whatever our generation of youth did was just right. And the parents who came before us were too conservative. They were sticks in the mud. But the kids that are coming after us are out of control. And whatever they're being exposed to is going to be dangerous and horrible. There's just something about as we get older, that's just what every generation of old people do. And I'm increasingly an old people. So I get it. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, but it's not like central to my life, necessarily. I don't love it in the same way that maybe Dungeons and Dragons or video games, But if we all went back to the 90s or something like that, had email and that was it, and that'd be fine, I guess. But it's just really hard for people to see it. And you can look for the same patterns. People are always going to bring up cigarette at some point. They're always going to say something like, we don't let kids drive a nuclear submarine, so why do we let them do this? There's always that kind of comment. There'll inevitably be the ad hominem. Oh, so you must work for the technology industry. You must work for Facebook or something of that sort, right? You can kind of see these similar kinds of patterns. And people get mad. That's the other thing. Is you say, people, I'm worried that my teenagers are on social media and that's going to hurt them. And actually, the data suggests it's probably not that big a deal. That really most of the reasons kids today have mental health problems come from parents. That neglect and abuse really is the big driving force. And even if maybe you leave the second half of that out, even if you just tell them the first half and say, well, actually, the data suggests is people get pissed. People get pissed about good news in a sense. And I think a lot of it is you will see people. And the weird thing about social media, right, is a lot of this debate is happening on social media. I can't think of another parallel of like people going on gamer Xbox platforms to complain about the dangers of video games, something like that. There's a parallel of people spending enormous amounts of time on social media complaining about the effects of social media on kids. And a lot of it's bragging. I see people all the time saying, I took the cell phone away from my kid. Look at what a great parent I am. And there's a lot of that kind of narrative as well. And I think that's why people get pissed. They're making parenting choices based on fear. And then you tell them, well, maybe the fear isn't really well founded, and people are maybe put in a spot or they felt really good about being a parent. They felt really moral. It probably wasn't fun getting into an argument with the kid about this. And then someone comes along and says it was all worth nothing and you're actually not that great a parent. So I get it. Or bad parent, but what you did didn't make you a good parent at any rate. And people get pissed about it. It is always interesting how just, how much anger there is around a lot of these moral panics, whether you're talking about the parents or the politicians or the scholars. And inevitably, it just does end up in this really dark place for a while. And then the old people die, and then it all goes away. And then
or some other thing comes up that people can make money off of. Like, video games stopped being such a panic in 2010 because, what started happening? Social media started becoming more popular. So smartphones started becoming more popular. And then you have people that say, oh, we have it we can freak out about.
Yeah. It definitely helps. So we got to come up with something to get people that we don't like, and then people can be, worried about that. What don't we like? Vegetables. Okay, vegetables let's get everybody panicking about. They're the silent killer. Every child who's ever eaten vegetables has died, eventually. So there you go. What more do we need to say?
That's why I try to avoid them as much as possible. They're not to be trusted.
Things that grow on weeds, nah. Yeah, I don't see it.
This makes me think back to the Columbine school shooting back in, I guess that was 2000, 99, somewhere in there. No, I was in high school then.
99, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I remember at the time people were blaming Marilyn Manson, who's this like metalhead guy that had a lot of very angry songs that appealed to kind of the goth subculture. And I guess like the shooters in Columbine, that they were fans of his. So instead of trying to diagnose the full situation, a lot of people were very quick to say, oh, well, it's Marilyn Manson and it's these other angry rock or metal music fans that are causing this to happen. And after that happened, it was interesting because there was an interview with Marilyn Manson, and when they asked him what he would say to those kids, is I would say anything. I would just sit and listen because that's what they need. And that's what they're not getting. We don't know what's going on with them. These kids certainly had their share of issues and they were feeling bullied and they weren't getting the support that they needed. And then they did a horrible thing. In that case, again, instead of parents and families and communities taking responsibility, saying, we're doing something that, or we're neglecting the people in our community from getting the support that they need and feeling protected from bullying and feeling safe. And we're always just looking for a scapegoat. Is that what we're doing now? In the case of technology and social media, like the scapegoat isn't even The technology companies, because the
Yeah.
bans aren't on the technology companies. The ban is
Yeah.
on kids.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it
So
is. It is. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I mean, and to kind of speak to what you were saying, just in the last couple of weeks, the CDC has come out with a couple reports based on their bi-yearly youth risk behavior survey. And first, they came out with one. So this is the first year, or 2023 was the first year where they asked a direct question about social media use. Everything before it had screen use, where they sort of threw Facebook in with television and computer use, whatever. So it's kind of hard to parcel out the. So now they have one question specific for social media, which is great. And so they released like one report just on that, and they found that basically that these are like potentially bivariate correlations that between social media use and mental health were basically near zero. But again, they ran like I don't know what it was. Maybe, I think it was almost 20,000 kids actually. So I mean, they were statistically significant, but they were like near zero effect sizes. So I didn't like the way that they sort of talked up these very super tiny correlations as if they were more meaningful. So they're so small they could likely be statistical noise, put it that way. And sometimes noise is statistically significant, when you have a big enough sample, and 20,000 is plenty big for that to happen. But the week, and they published a second study, and now they looked at what they call, or a lot of people call, adverse childhood events. So this is like your parent abused you or sexually molested you or something of that sort. And the effect sizes were enormous. I mean, here it was it was night and day difference between like these piddling little tiny, absolutely noise level effects for social media versus kids who are reporting being neglected or emotionally or physically or sexually abused by their families. Or maybe some of the questions, but I don't remember all the questions, but did you have a parent who committed suicide or something? There are all these kind of like really horrible things that some kids have gone through. And those effect sizes were enormous. Those are very strong. They're still bivariate correlation, but they were very strong correlations. And they're fair criticisms. They still self-report. Maybe the questions aren't always asked the best way. There are fair criticisms of the CDC's methods. But I mean, again, sort of taking this at face value, I mean, this was a night and day sort of effect. If you're really serious about kids' mental health, what we know is that social media we can argue whether it's zero or almost zero. That's the argument. But if you're really concerned, we ought to be talking about families, because obviously the kids who are suffering, it's their parents, that one way or the other, whether the parents have committed suicide and that's putting stress on the family, or the parents are abusive, or they're neglectful, or the kids don't feel love from or maybe mom or dad went to prison, or it's that kind of stuff that's really hurting the kids that are hurting. And Mike Males has a Substack, and he does a lot of great work with the CDC data. And he's trying to hammer this point home. But if we want to worry about kids, then we should be looking at what's happening in their families, because that's what's driving this. And it's not a surprise if you look at the data on suicide, which actually has been optimistic. So for kids, for youth, teens, suicide went down in 2022, actually, where it continued going up for middle-aged adults. So there was some optimistic data for kids. And last year, the CDC said that even kids' self-reported mental health got better. So we're starting to seeing a little bit of a positive trend with teens. But in general, I mean, so teen girls, for instance, are the least suicide committing group of people. The people that commit suicide are young Native American men, which probably isn't a shock because they live oftentimes in poverty and with very few things to look forward to with education or work, and middle-aged white dudes like me also tend to have high suicide rates. So, I mean, and it's probably not a surprise that as middle-aged adult suicide has risen remarkably over the past, really has, much faster than with teens, that some of that is probably just dragging some of those teens along with it. Because if your dad commits suicide, that puts an enormous amount of stress on you as a teenager, whether you're a boy or a girl, right? Or if your dad is so wrapped, or mom, sometimes it's moms too, is wrapped up in their own stress and mental health problems and depression, then they're probably not paying attention to you, or they're snapping at you, or they're just so tense I don't know, they hit you when they shouldn't. They always shouldn't, right? And I think that's the missing piece here. We all gotten seduced by this whole social media thing, which at some point we're going to have to admit, like, come on, the data just aren't there. Broad claims that are being made. I think the data from different sources are much clearer that what's happening is you have a lot of stressed out parents, and that is trickling down onto their kids. And if you want to really be concerned about things like teen mental health, teen suicide, you're going to have to look at this holistically, that this is a parent-child dyad, a family-child dyad situation, and you're going to need to look at larger things that are affecting whole family units if you're really going to try to fix this. And that's why I think like the real tragedy of a lot of this stuff, all this debate or the anxious generation, all that kind of stuff, is I do, and I hate to be sort of hyperbolic myself, but I really do think that it does have the danger of distracting society away from these real issues that are not sexy, I guess, or they're not the scapegoaty kind of thing. They're more complicated. But I think to the extent that we don't pay attention to those things, we're going to see, whether it's the middle-aged adults or the teens, we're going to see more people who either suffer or in some cases may die because we just didn't want to talk about this. We wanted to talk about social media. I think that's the reality and the real tragedy of this, how this whole conversation has developed. The same thing like with video games. We did crap all about like gun control and the whole time that it was very purposefully a distraction on the political right, at least, from talking about gun. If you really want to save young men's lives, making sure that mentally ill or gang involved young men can't get access to firearms is going to do a lot more good than taking away their Call of Duty game or something of that sort. It sounds so obvious when I say it that way, but I don't know why it's so difficult to convince the power brokers of society that this is the reality we have to deal with.
So, do you think that there's some sort of I don't know, distraction here, an intentional distraction?
It's not like a grassy knoll kind of conspiracy thing, right? I don't think any set out to like screw teenagers over necessarily. I think it's possible to start with good intentions, but once you've got skin in the game, then you're in a position of defending your kingdom. I think that's what's happened with a lot of the politicians. Like, you have to cater to the audience, and right now the audience is a bunch of scared old people. So you have to get votes as a politician. And once you've made a big stink about social media, you can't say you made a mistake and go back. If you're somebody who's an advocate, you work for an advocacy organization, that's how they make money, by scaring the shit out of people. Or you've got a best-selling book. You can't go, whoopsie, everybody, I'll give you a refund on my book because it turns out it was full of crap sort of situation. Or this news media, same thing. I've heard just anecdotally that there are some scholars that are getting, I guess, use the word harassed, but they're getting Freedom of Information Act requests over and over and over and over from the same journalists, even though they keep saying, no, I don't work for a technology company. No, I don't get any funding from these companies and stuff. I think those have been outlets that have put a lot of prestige into scaring the crap out of people over some of these issues. So I think it's difficult. We always talk about like scholars, news media, and politicians as being kind of like these sustaining forces for a moral panic, right? The driving forces, the old people who are panicking. And like I said, I put myself in that category of at least being an old people. And so, because the old people vote, they're the ones that buy newspapers and the books, and they're the ones that, at least in the elite class, have the funding to give for grants for scholars and all this kind of stuff, right? These three categories of people have to cater to that panic until the old people die, and then that's when it all goes away for the most part, essentially. So I don't think it requires us to think that there's like a vast like conspiracy of the Illuminati or anything, or that anybody's a bad person. I think people are just behaving like people do, which is and self-interestedly, and none of us are immune to that. And I don't say that I'm immune to that. So I think it's just normal human behavior that moral panics are promoted mainly by self-interest for a while. And it's very easy for all of us to convince ourselves that what is to our own benefit is also benefiting others, kind of thing. So it doesn't require us to think anybody's evil. Some people are evil, but it doesn't require us to think that this is like a vast conspiracy of evil people, or that the folks that have done wrong things are inherently bad human beings necessarily. They're just human beings. And we know from history this is what people do. I mean, even Frederick Wertham, I don't think he was a bad guy. He was wrong, but he did have a best-selling book and he had lots of political prestige. I think that probably was wonderful for him, and he defended that. But do I think on some level he also convinced himself he was helping teens? Sure, I think he probably did. Yeah. So I think that's what's happening now with a lot of people that are promoting this particular panic, is I think they, on some level, think they're doing well, but it just happens to, by some happy coincidence, fit with their own personal benefit. So why not go with it? I'd probably do it too.
I often find that there's a pretty big distinction in people's beliefs about what the problem with tech is and what the solution should be based on whether or not they've actually worked with data inside one of these companies. For example, social media age limits and age verification are pretty popular among elected officials and the general public. But my colleagues and I at the Integrity
Yeah.
Institute ran a survey of trust and safety experts from the biggest tech companies. And these experts overwhelmingly
Yeah.
oppose these crude policy proposals that don't actually address any of the underlying issues or hold tech companies accountable for harms that happen to people using their platforms. It's clear that these platforms do contribute, or at least facilitate harms to people, and they've been implicated in some really terrible events around the world. At the same time, though, these platforms do connect people and
Yeah.
help many people find social support when they might otherwise feel like they cannot in the offline world. This is especially true for people with concealable stigmatized identities
Yeah.
like non
Absolutely.
heterosexual orientations or mental illness.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, people, especially teens, feel like they cannot talk to their parents or teachers about these things, but they can obtain that support online.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree with everything you said in terms of marginalized communities and such. And of course, in fairness, it's true for kids that don't come from marginalized communities too. I mean, the Pew Research Centers basically found that most kids really do like their cell phones. So it's not a shocker, but most of them find value in them. They may aspects of what happens with them, but they generally find them to be a pretty positive influence in their lives. And what's been interesting is there have been these like cell phone bans in schools, right? That we're dealing with some in Florida, Orange County, which is right next to where I live. I live in Seminole County, Florida, but they even went more stringent than the state did in terms of you can't use them at lunch or any, even outside of class and stuff. And a couple interesting things. One, it turns out the parents don't like that. A lot of the parents they start to see the value in the cell phone too. Like, yeah, I do want to be able to talk to my kid. What if my kid is having a bad day and needs a little bit of support? These aren't necessarily life or death situations, but even the parents can kind of see these. What if I can't pick my kid up because something happened? How am I going to let him know that he needs to take the bus if you don't give him the phone until he's on the bus or not on the bus, apparently? But the other thing about this is, and I actually got data from Orange County, is so in Orange County, which is a big district in fairness, but that resulted in something like 660 suspensions in the last years. Kids got suspended from school for violating cell phone bans, and it was probably multiple times. It wasn't just once, but multiple times. So maybe they're a little bit naughty, whatever. But we know suspensions are like really bad for kids. Actually, that they're not surprisingly their grades go down. Even the criminal justice literature finds that kids who experience suspensions are more likely to have adult arrests and that kind of stuff. And again, those might not be huge correlations, so there's reasons to worry about, like you kind of were implying, like the downstream negative impacts of some of the policies are built on this fear. And I kind of get it that you don't want kids typing on their cell phone while they're supposed to be learning algebra. And I'm sort of open to that conversation. But if you're actually suspending them, you're actually doing some of these kids real harm in the name of protecting them. So a lot of stuff just isn't terribly, thought through. I mean, and I think the missing part of the conversation here that I think really would be helpful for kids and adults, honestly, is really like media literacy. Like, how do you use this thing in a way that is going to, as you said, maximize the good of this thing, the bad? And some of that is going to be like more privacy issues. Be careful what you reveal on social media, understanding that anything you say can be viewed by a wide audience. Is you should not expect even your private stuff is going to stay private. We've seen multiple examples of that stuff slipping out. And so if maybe you're going to share a Hitler joke just to be sardonic and it's ironic, you know what I mean? And maybe your friends would understand the context in which you're doing it, but you really shouldn't do that on social media because other people are going to see it out of context and are going to be offended by it. And that could have real repercussions for you. Same thing like in Florida, it's a threaten anybody over social media. So there are examples, and some of that's fair. If you have a bomb threat and you put that on social media, like the cops probably need to at least talk to you. But if you're like, lots of kids say stuff like "I'm gonna kill you," whatever, it's an idiom, right? We all know they don't mean necessarily like literally, but you have to tell kids you can't say that on social media because it looks like a threat, and the cops will come, and you may get a felony for something that would not even be a charge at all on the schoolyard playground. So there are these like safety issues that kids need to be taught that getting into an argument with a stranger on social media probably isn't worth the possible costs. That's something a lot of adults need that lesson, I think, to some extent. That it's just like social media hygiene would be useful to teach kids how to use blocks, mutes, how to use the followed versus the for you feature. I just learned that in Twitter and this kind of stuff. Basically, how to cultivate your social media experience So you're not being exposed to crap that's going to maybe make you feel bad. I wish we could do this stuff with newspapers too, but we can't.
It's okay. Newspapers are not going to be around that much longer. They're going the way of the dinosaurs, sadly.
Maybe. We can only hope, right? It'd just be the New York Times all the time. Only the New York Times, nothing else, which may or may not be good. But yeah, the positive side is that these tools do exist. Cultivate your social media experience, and also you can be wise about how you use social media in a way that again capitalizes on the positives, and you don't do something stupid that ends up in the negative. And I think it's also part of the conversation that got missed because, like I said, the research really just has gone down the rabbit hole of time spent, right? It's all this idea of like kids mere exposure, spending time on social media is bad. And that's not what the data says. And if you went back 10 years ago, there were a few people that were doing some really interesting stuff, looking more at like, well, what did you do while you were on social media? And I think the reasonable conversation is, and I always tell when I this, like I'm on Facebook, which is social media for old people at this point. I literally go on my like high school page to see who's dead at this point. It's like the obituary pages of social media. But when I post on Facebook, I'm supposed to like, hey, look at my shiny new convertible, or look at my beautiful wife, or here's like another thing that's cool. I post my Substack articles on there. So it's me bragging, honestly. Whenever I have something, those rare occasions I have something to brag about, right? It's me. And what the research says is that actually, maybe it's obnoxious to other people, but that actually people feel good when they do that. If I'm posting something cool on social media and I, delude myself into thinking other people are going to read it, then that makes me feel good. On the other hand, if comparing yourself negatively to others on social media. And I guess maybe I'm lucky. I married a beautiful woman. I do actually have a convertible. I have all my hair still at 53. I have a pretty cool job and stuff. But if you're the person that's like bald and unemployed and divorced 3 times and estranged from their kids and working at a job that's not rewarding, and you see someone that is in your cohort who's doing better, that makes you feel bad, and you keep doing it. I think that's where you tend to see. I'm using this as a weird example. I'm not trying to make myself sound like everybody's comparing themselves to me on social media, and they're not. I know that they're not. Don't get me wrong. But if you do that sort of thing and you compare yourself to others and it makes you bad, and you keep doing it, then that's going to be associated with some negative outcomes. That's not a shocker. And then the question becomes, well, how do you convince people? How do you get people not to do that kind of thing? The same thing like doom scrolling. If you're just looking for bad news, it's just time. It's like anything else. If you're not having fun doing the thing, stop doing the thing. Touch grass, whatever the cliche is that we're using today. Social media should be fun. I think people sometimes feel like they have an obligation to use it in ways that they don't really have an obligation to use it. Like they have to engage in conversations that are unpleasant, and you really don't have any obligation to engage in social media in that way. If it's not, unless you're a big company or something like that, and even big companies more the crowd than they do. Twitter's not real life. Facebook's not real life, or a real graveyard, even though it's starting to approximate one. So just log off and do something different. But so I think we really should talk to people about this sort of how to manage this tool in the same way you need to tell people don't get on the top step of a ladder. Ladders are a good thing. We want ladders. We don't want to ban people from using ladders. We don't want to ban teens from using ladders. But if you get on that wobbly top step and you're stepping on the sign that says "Don't step on me," then that's not so great. You know what I mean? And we know people do it, right? It's like seatbelts. Like you just have to keep telling people, just be careful what you do and do things responsibly. And eventually people will get the message. I started earlier with kids, but that requires allowing them to use the thing, right? We kind of had some kind of process, whether parents are doing it or schools are doing it, where we taught kids how to responsibly use social media and cell phones and things like that. I think that would be much more positive than this idea that we should shield them from ever touching these things like they're plutonium until they hit age 18. And then suddenly we just give them to them and hope for the best, which I don't think is going to work out like people think it's going to work out. Because adults are idiots too. It's not like suddenly you become 18 or 21 or 25 and I mean, look at all the journalists who are on Twitter who've made asses of themselves in various ways over the last 5 years or so, or scholars for that matter.
And the Karen and Kevin videos over the last 5 years.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, exactly. There's nothing magical about turning 18 in terms of managing your social media use. It's a tool, and it's like anything else. It's mostly a positive tool, but sometimes people can use it in ways that are not super helpful for themselves. And I think the best thing we can do is try to teach people how to use this thing better. But ultimately, if someone doesn't wear it's on them. I mean, they decide not to wear the seatbelt. If you put a big sign on the top of the step ladder that says "Don't step on me," and they step on it, then gravity kills. That's what happens. So then that's on you at some point. This idea that we're going to blame Meta or Instagram, which I guess is part of Meta now, but any of these companies I don't think that's reasonable to do that. There may be some things that they could do a little bit better. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's a much smaller problem than people made it out to be. And I think ultimately you just can't protect everybody from making bad decisions. And somebody with anything is going to make bad decisions. And most often we accept that. We accept that some people are going to make bad decisions with ladders or power tools or cars or other kinds of things. And we still let people use them. We let teens use them. So it's not like cigarettes. It's not the same thing as cigarettes. Stop talking about cigarettes, people. It just makes you look silly.
Some of the researchers do say that using social media is worse for you than chain smoking cigarettes or even using hard drugs. So it's hard to ignore that analogy when some of these voices are using those as kind of linchpins of their arguments.
So I'm going to talk stats a little bit. So everybody bear with me for a second. So I've read the papers on cigarettes. The odds of you, if you are a male 2-pack-a-day smoker, of getting lung cancer alone, not all the other stuff that cigarettes do to you, lung cancer alone, your odds go up by 2,600% if you're a male 2-day smoker. 2,600% increase. There's like nothing in all of, I don't know, drinking plutonium shakes probably are about the same level of the very, very few things in average society has that much of a damaging impact on our health as cigarette smoking does. Maybe like heavy alcohol consumption might be close, stuff like that. I can tell you so it's the equivalent of the correlation coefficient of like 0.95 or something like that. Almost perfect correlation between smoking and lung cancer, where you don't see the correlations. If you took them at face value, the correlation coefficients for social media use and mental health are somewhere between 0, maybe 0.1. I vary it. When you do control for other things, it's probably close to like 0.06. They're just different ballparks altogether. And again, we can have this debate about whether a correlation coefficient of 0.06 is meaningful or noise or not, but it's nowhere near these massive correlations you see for what happens when you smoke cigarettes. So I don't know what the hell's wrong with statisticians who are making that comparison. This is just absolutely unwarranted to do anything like that.
I want to be mindful, but I'd like to ask one more question.
Sure.
What is the biggest issue that you think that we need to really focus on to fix social media technology and create a safer place for young people in the modern day?
I think media literacy. Well, I have two answers to that. One is just to stop talking about social media altogether and focus in on other things that are really meaningful, like families and parental abuse and neglect. And that's what we really should be doing. But taking your question and not trying to distort it into a different question is media literacy. I think there's an argument that whether, again, parents do it or it has to be something more formalized, schools are doing it, although schools are already super stretched. We can't make schools do everything parents should be doing. But having conversations with kids about like, okay, here's your cell phone, and we need to start talking about responsible use and healthy use of this sort of thing. I think the majority of kids will get it. They're still going to misbehave. I mean, they're kids, and you can't shield them from everything they're going to do. We know they're going to do some naughty things. And then also being responsible or being smart as adults in the sense of, like, if a 14-year-old says, I'm going to kill you to another 14-year-old on social media, and they were just blowing off steam, then they don't have any intent. They don't have a weapon. It's just kids on the schoolyard, just moved on to Instagram. Don't give them a felony offense. It has to be some sort of common sense as involved in some of this process too. So I think we try to use the legal system more than we should to fix some of these problems with stuff. Now, again, if they have the weapon, they have the intent, then they should get the felony offense. Investigators have to be somewhat smart and look at these things on a case-by-case basis. But I think this crude use of the legal system, whether it's lawsuits or regulation or these felony charges for more and more things, I don't think it's been very constructive. I think it really is like some kind of media literacy, whether it's informal or formal, will fix most of this problem. And then, like I said, just stop scaring the shit out of parents about this stuff, because that's just causing way more problems. It's making people irrational, and it's not helping anybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of you watching this video. If you have questions for either of us, please do ask them in the comment section, and I'll answer all that I can. If you like this video and want to see more of them, please do subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you so much.